They promised the alliance of Sahel states would crawl back to the old table. They swore sanctions, border squeezes, and choreographed headlines would box the Sahel into obedience. The prediction was simple: tighten the vise, fracture morale, trigger an elite split, and stage a return under familiar terms. The reality arrived in public, and it did not arrive as surrender. In early August 2025, the same microphone that once signaled pressure began to ask for partnership. As chair of the ECOWAS Authority, President Julius Maada Bio called for stronger ties with the AES countries, invoking trade, free movement, peace, and security as common ground. That is not a rumor behind closed doors. That is a vocabulary shift. Confrontation turned into cooperation on camera. Before we go deeper, hit like and subscribe if African sovereignty is not a dream but a decision, because the receipts I am about to lay out rewrite the script. Set your map on Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. These were sold as capitals to be encircled by rules and headlines. Instead, the orbit reversed. Deepened ties. Replaced. Tightened pressure. The phrase is not decoration. It is an admission that corridors do not move, borders do not breathe, and markets do not balance without the AES spine holding the Sahel together. When leverage dies, it does not hold a press conference to confess it. It simply changes its words and hopes you do not notice. Two engines drove the turn. First, the sanctions and isolation playbook underperformed. Markets rerouted. Haulage and air corridors adapted. Quiet exemptions multiplied. Each week of bottlenecks converted into political costs for the enforcers, not the targets. Workarounds hardened into new paths, and suppliers learned the map that pressure drew was not the only way to move. Sanctions designed to starve legitimacy ended up starving the argument for endless pressure. When ledgers and convoys say the plan is bleeding, the podium changes its tone because reality already has. Second, the coercive shortcut failed to produce collapse. The Coup pathway, the old colonial reflex, did not break the will it aimed at. In Burkina Faso, an attempted destabilization was stopped, and the street did not reward the saboteurs. Resolve hardened. The spectacle that was supposed to terrify people back into the status quo only reminded them why they left it. When violence loses its narrative power and sanctions lose their economic sting, the road that remains is the road that should have been taken from the start. Speak, not threaten. Coordinate, not command. Ask, not order. Listen to the new vocabulary. Deepen relations. Promote trade. Restore free movement. Enhance peace and security. These are not the words of a bloc preparing to punish. These are the words of a bloc acknowledging a center of gravity it cannot move without. Notice what is missing. No ultimatums. No clocks attached to red lines. The music shifted from marching drums to negotiation strings, and the conductor did not change, the sheet music did. Language becomes policy when field realities set the limits. The reversal is temporal as well as rhetorical. For months, the storyline sold to the public was a straight road. Apply pressure, watch the Sahel fold, usher a return. The reality has been cyclical. Apply pressure, watch adaptation bloom, then watch the pressure campaign circle back to the negotiator's desk. In that loop, the power to dictate erodes. The bloc that refused to bend can now refuse to hurry. The bloc that set the pressure can now only set the meeting. When an adversary's timetable becomes a calendar of your choosing, sovereignty is not a future promise. It is a present practice. There is a deeper lesson inside the turn. The language changed in public because capacity changed in the field. AES leaders did not wait for permission. They engineered alternatives at speed. Security cooperation that raises the cost of sabotage, logistics that redraw supply lines, data discipline that denies external backdoors, and a narrative backbone that counters borrowed talking points. Doctrine matured under fire. The tests were not academic. They were convoys that arrived, communications that held, borders that did not panic, and communities that declined scripted chaos. Each success rewired expectations. Each failure of pressure raised the price of theater. Do not mistake civility for victory. The call for stronger ties is not a friendly embrace. It is a record of miscalculation written in diplomatic ink. It preserves face by pronouncing stability, while admitting, between the lines, that the tool set designed to enforce stability could not deliver it. That is why the outreach is framed as regional necessity. Because it is. Trade wants roads, not embargoes. Free movement wants permits, not proclamations. Security wants coordination, not editorials. And none of those stand upright today without the AES column behind them. We begin at the hinge. The promise sold to the public was that force applied from outside would compel obedience inside. The evidence delivered to the public is that force has become an invitation. Next, we open the machine and show the gears. The IMF strings behind aid. The ritual of conditionalities, the enforcement arm that wore the ECOWAS badge, and the media cover that turned pressure into virtue. We will show why that intricate trap kept malfunctioning against a bloc that rebuilt its own logistical, diplomatic, and narrative supply lines on the fly, and why the chairman's microphone had to speak the quiet truth at last. If pressure was supposed to bend a nation, why is the one doing the bending now asking for a hand? Open the machine and watch the gears bite. First comes debt, dressed as policy advice. The IMF writes ceilings and triggers. The aid. Community supplies the bridge loans, and the repayment calendar becomes a leash. Next comes conditionality, liberalize this, privatize that. Surrender tariff discretion, keep the currency soft enough for importers and predictable for outsiders. Then the enforcement arm steps in under a regional badge. ECOWAS issues communiques, committees threaten suspension, and border agencies receive, temporary, rules that can last months. Finally, the media varnish declares all this a rescue. Stability talkers measuring progress by how neatly the target obeys. History set the mold. The CFA architecture built after 1945 made convertibility a promise and autonomy a rumor. When the franc zone devalued in the 1990s, exporters cheered and households paid. The lesson that stuck was cruelly simple: policy could be shaved in Paris, and the bill delivered in Bamako and Ouagadougou. Across the years, the rhetoric never changed. Discipline first, development later. While the real discipline was imposed on prices, pensions, and patience. The template survived because it served those who wrote it. Translate the trap into today's levers. Borders are snapped shut in the name of order. Air corridors are restricted under the language of safety. Payment rails tighten as correspondent banks decide which invoices can breathe. Import licenses freeze, then though only with waivers. Insurance premiums spike for logistics passing through non-compliant routes. None of these switches wear the word sanctions on their face. All of them behave like sanctions in practice. They slow time, raise costs, and convert normal life into a queue. Who benefits? Middlemen with the right stamps. Fixers who sell. Facilitation. Third country shippers who launder origin. Consultants who produce justification papers. Those nearest the rulebook learn to monetize delay. Those farthest from the microphone pay for it. The market woman who cannot move tomatoes from Bobo Dioulasso because a checkpoint changed its hours. The pharmacist whose supplier cannot clear a pallet because the payment bounced in a foreign compliance filter. The student stranded because flights were rescheduled. In the name of stability, pressure that was sold as a path to constitutional order becomes a tax on being poor. Zoom in on the diagram. IMF terms to aid strings to ECOWAS enforcement to media cover. Each arrow assumes the target has no redundancy, no alliances, and no public stamina for pain. Each arrow presumes that fear outruns ingenuity. Yet the lived physics of the Sahel do not obey these presumptions. Traders redraw their routes and share them by word of mouth faster than any communique can be drafted. Hauliers build night convoys. Carriers discover alternative airfields. Payment workarounds multiply, split invoices, escrow buffers, regional clearing arrangements, until the map looks less like a cage and more like a maze with exits the designers never studied. Add the quiet arithmetic. Every month a corridor stays blocked, a neighbor loses fees, a city loses customs, and a government loses credibility with its own business class. Every delay invites a workaround that will not disappear when the mood changes. Normalization is the saboteur of sanctions. Once a parallel path is learned, the old road never recovers its monopoly. The media layer completes the theater. Panels rehearse the phrases: restore order, return to constitutional normalcy, protect regional stability, while skipping the receipts. Medicines delayed, harvests wasted, haulage costs doubled. The target is painted as irresponsible for refusing to comply. The enforcer is painted as responsible for raising the price of disobedience. But when the price lands on the wrong households long enough, the story slips. People stop repeating adjectives and start counting bills. This is why the machinery was doomed against an opponent that refused to argue on paper and chose to build in the field. The assumption behind the trap, that AES would lack redundancy, bravery, and memory, was wrong. Redundancy arrived as new corridors. Bravery arrived as calm under intimidation. Memory arrived as a lesson every time the lever was pulled. The public saw who paid. The trap still clicks. It no longer closes. If you have seen this script play out in your own city, drop a comment with where you are watching from. Let us map the pattern together. So if the trap was that tight, how did AES leaders walk through it without breaking stride? This was not luck. It was engineering under pressure. While the old order tightened levers, AES leaders built alternatives that no lever could choke. The sequence is clear. In January 2024, the Sahel states announced their exit from ECOWAS. In July 2024, they signed a confederal treaty that made coordination the default. Through 2025, paper became muscle. Joint patrols, escorted convoys, and cross-border hotlines that solved problems faster than any communique. Name the architecture so no one can pretend not to see it. Aerial and ISR layer. Fixed-wing surveillance rotorcraft and UAV grids stitched borderlands into a watch field. Smuggling tracks and ambush sites were mapped and interrupted. Local logistics layer. Fuel staging repair points and convoy discipline turned fragile roads into arteries. Where ambushes were chronic, bulldozers moved the earth. Markets in Bobo-Dioulasso and along the Ouagadougou-Niamey axis were not told to wait. Protection corridors let work resume. Data and comms layer. On-prem command systems replaced foreign hosted platforms. Encrypted radios and fiber spines carried flight logs, convoy manifests, and incident maps on servers that did not answer to outside passwords. With latency cut and leaks sealed, decision cycles shortened and execution tightened. Alliance and training layer. Instructor cadres rotated through partner camps with one doctrine: standardize what works, retire what wastes time. A Nigerian lieutenant could plug into a Burkina Faso unit and match tempo without a translator. Narrative defense layer. Claim versus receipt segments became routine. Community radio replaced rumor chains and pre-empted planted scripts. When critics guessed, AES showed. When fabrications spread, counter footage met them at the door. Now tie the layers back to the sanction maze and the coup reflex. Sanctions demand that the target remains still. A moving target dissolves them. A coup requires a hole in the logistics spine, the comms net, or the narrative shield. The architecture sealed those holes. That is why pressure felt heavy on paper but light in the field. It met a system designed to flow around it. Anchor the calendar so the lesson does not float. The January 2024 exit removed the legal fiction that the old framework could dictate tempo. The July 2024 Confederal Treaty converted coordination from ad hoc to automatic. In early 2025, protected commercial lanes reopened under national rules, and interdictions along feeder tracks rose as integrated patrols matured. That is why the podium's voice softened. Reality set the range of options. There is also the ledger. Payment reroutes and bilateral settlements reduced choke points that once throttled invoices. Local procurement kept fuel, rations, and spares cycling even when a foreign switchboard frowned. Stockpiles moved from paper to depots. Pressure withers against slack because slack buys time, and time buys choices. Share this with one friend who still believes sanctions equal control. Because control collapses when the target builds a parallel system. The doctrine is not mysterious. Watch, move, connect, train, explain. Repeat until the habit becomes the institution. Repetition, not rhetoric. Turned isolation into invitation, and it can be copied across the map. Empires rarely accept checkmate in silence. So how did the pushback arrive, and why did it fail? Pressure does not retire quietly. It tries one last door in the dark. When sanctions failed to choke supply lines and headlines stopped moving hearts, the playbook advanced. Restoration was rehearsed until it sounded like mercy. First, the sanctions escalator. Border instructions lengthened without saying closure. Air corridors were revised. Bank guidance was updated, and routine invoices tripped compliance alarms. These are strikes on time, not tanks. Tomatoes from Bobo-Dioulasso to Ouagadougou sat for a memo. Carriers into Niger were asked for papers invented yesterday. Pressure sold as order became a levy on households and a liability for officials. Then the covert shortcut tried to carry the weight sanctions could not. The timeline is short because decisive events are T-72, rumor seeding about an imminent correction, T-24, anonymous notices citing security concerns, amplified by borrowed accounts, TD night, small units moved on a relay station and a logistics yard, counting on surprise, T+6, patrol patterns did not match the script, attempted nodes were isolated, T+24, arrests and quiet replacement of uniforms that forgot who they served, T+72, crowds gathered to say no, not to debate ideology, but to defend routines that keep food and roads open. The media layer tried to rescue the frame. Spokespeople called the failure, contained instability, then recycled indictment, illegitimacy, isolation, economic harm. It collided with receipts people carried, shipments arriving, because corridors were protected, clinics open, because fuel was procured outside the maze, salaries paid because budgets favored the ground. History warns in three names: Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi. But the difference now is architecture. The AES deterrence design, watch, move, connect, train, explain, does not make leaders invulnerable. It makes plots predictable and costly. Surprise travels on slow feet when patrols are standardized, comms hardened, depots dispersed, and rumor must outrun community radio. Public sentiment did the rest. Market women who learned new routes do not want the checkpoint theater back. Veterans see through uniforms with no chain of command. Clergy and elders recognize that stability has been rented to justify interruptions that never fed a child. Unions ask the only question that matters: who pays when politics plays with corridors? Why did the backlash misfire? Because it met an object already in motion. The AES moveset created redundancy, alternative corridors and bilateral settlements that turned delays into detours. It created legitimacy, visible service delivery that shrank abstract claims about hoarder. It created memory. People remember who introduced costs and who removed them. And it created time, the rarest currency in politics. Lawfare arrived late, waving letters as though ink could redraw maps. Procurement theater claimed only old brokers could deliver a generator or a vial. NGO choreography queued reports that mistook compliance for care. Such tactics work once. After the first reroute, the first audit, the first community win over paperwork, they become case studies in how not to lose a continent. If you caught the headlines when the story broke, save this video and send it to the loudest doubter in your group. Then watch what happens next. If the strike fell flat and the sanctions drew blood the wrong way, what does a real win look like in numbers, not adjectives? Now the numbers must speak. A win like this is not a mood, it is a map, a ledger, a timetable. Start with security. The protected Ouagadougou-Niamey axis is moving again under joint AES escort rules. Ambush incidents along the known choke points have fallen while interdictions on feeder tracks have risen. Average response windows on border alerts have shortened because radios, hotlines, and standardized patrol patterns cut the distance between report and action. When roads breathe, markets follow, and speculation loses oxygen. Trade and mobility confirm the shift. Carriers that parked for administrative clarification, are rolling on scheduled convoys with predictable departure slots. Border dwell times that spiked during the sanctions phase are compressing to pre-crisis ranges where state coordination, not improvisation, sets the pace. Air cargo that detoured through distant hubs is rebalancing through closer fields, lowering spoilage on perishables and stabilizing wholesale prices. The point is simple. Pressure distorted supply, the blueprint restored rhythm. Procurement and financing show the backbone. Domestic fuel and rations buys are being placed earlier and closer to the corridors they feed. Essential spares are pre-positioned so a broken axle does not become a broken week. Payment reroutes and bilateral settlements reduce exposure to foreign compliance switches that once froze invoices mid-journey. Treasury lines that once waited for permission are tied to delivery milestones, not to donor calendars. The state regained the right to time, and time is the currency that cancels panic. Diplomacy has receipts too. Where ultimatums once crowded the air, technical MOUs now codify what works. Joint patrol templates, cross-border incident forms, emergency call trees with clock-bound escalation, and corridor insurance that rewards compliance with lower risk premiums. Free movement language is re-entering communiques, not as nostalgia, but as a logistics instrument that keeps labor, parts, and relief within reach. When neighbors price stability into contracts, rhetoric is just catching up with practice. Public services mirror the dividend. Clinics on convoy routes report fewer stockouts because deliveries match their cold chain windows. School districts resume testing calendars because transport is no longer a rumor. Market unions publish rate cards to keep pricing honest as wholesalers rebuild inventories. Each is a small, local receipt. But together they write an argument no press release can erase. Coordination under AES rules is delivering ordinary life at scale. And ordinary life is the harshest test of any political claim. Let one human voice certify the data. A tomato trader from Bobodia Lasso, who lost 2 harvests to checkpoint theater, now budgets by departure time again, not by prayer. A driver who once slept 3 nights at a sealed barrier now plans fuel stops by the hour. A student who missed an exam when flights were rescheduled lands in time to register. None of them cares for grand speeches. All of them count what arrives. Sovereignty is not a flag in these stories. It is a timetable that finally holds. Replicability is the lesson you cannot afford to miss. The blueprint is not mystical. Map the critical corridors. Secure them with repeatable drills. Digitize dispatch, incident, and turnaround. Substitute imports where possible, and buy locally where it secures time. Settle payments on rails that you can govern. Explain what you are doing so rumors cannot sell fear at a premium. Do this long enough, and even a sanctions maze becomes a set of doors you already have keys for. The invitation that followed pressure was earned, not gifted. If this is the first time you have seen these receipts lined up, hit like, so this reaches more people the algorithm would rather keep asleep. If pressure turned into an invitation here, what happens when the rest of Africa stops knocking and starts building? Name the doctrine so it cannot be hidden again. Foiled coups plus backfired sanctions equal a legitimacy loss for neo-colonial control. That is the equation the street understands, the markets confirm, and the microphones just admit in softer words. The story you have watched is not a twist of fate. It is a manual written under pressure, line by line, until even opponents began to quote its conclusions. Clarity without action rots. So convert the win into a habit. Start with receipts. Archive the exact phrases, dates, and reversals that marked this turn. Keep a living timeline of when ECOWAS hardened its language and when it softened it, when borders stalled and when corridors breathed, when rumor tried to sprint and when community radio walked it down. Memory is not nostalgia. Memory is a security system. Organize where the pressure once bit. Corridor committees in market towns, driver unions with incident forms that match the patrol templates, traders associations that publish rate cards and expose gatekeepers who monetize delay. When prices are transparent and violations are logged, Sabotage becomes expensive and theater becomes visible. The same applies to procurement. Push ministries and municipalities to publish local content floors for essentials tied to corridor stability, fuel, spares, cold chain supplies, school and clinic inputs. The closer the supply, the harder it is to strangle. Guard the narrative spine. Claim versus receipt should not be an occasional segment. It should be a reflex. When a talking point arrives, answer with the map, the timetable, the invoice, and the human witness who can verify them. Rumor thrives on absent documents. Show the document. Teach youths to cut and label clips correctly, to mark inference versus fact, and to track corrections publicly. Narrative sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a workflow. Take the doctrine into law and work. Demand procurement rules that blacklist the rent seekers of the crisis. Demand border standards that cannot be, temporarily, rewritten without signatures that cost careers. Demand union clauses that protect convoy escorts and drivers who refuse illicit detours. The point is not to collect enemies. The point is to collect mechanisms that outlive whoever sits at a desk. Bring the diaspora into formation. Ask for research support, legal drafting, and corridor insurance models that reward compliance with lower risk premiums. Ask for a roster of experts who can testify when the next accusations are filed at regional courts. Ask for cultural work, music, film, comics that teaches the timeline without preaching it. A doctrine that cannot be sung will be forgotten. A doctrine that can be sung will be carried. Turn etiquette into pressure. When officials speak of stability, ask them to define it in logistics terms. Border dwell times, response windows, stockout rates, convoy frequency. If they cannot show the numbers, they are selling a paragraph. If they can, reward them with public thanks and keep the baseline moving upward. Praise in this work is not flattery, it is calibration. Now, confront yourself. Will you watch from the sidelines or help build the systems that make sovereignty ordinary? The invitation issued after pressure is not a gift to AES alone. It is the proof that organization beats orchestration. The capitals, once supposed to be encircled, Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, did not wait for permission. They set a tempo and held it. If you want this win to survive its headline, match that tempo where you live. Comment: should other nations abandon ECOWAS enforcement and join AES cooperation? Send this to one person who still trusts sanctions. Subscribe to our channel. We publish the receipts they bury. History will not file this under miracles. It will file it under maintenance. Keep the corridors open. Keep the receipts current. Keep the doctrine short enough to teach and exact enough to enforce. The era of begging is over because the era of building has begun. History is choosing new architects. Either you build it or you get built over.